behalf of the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention, I would like to welcome you to this particular webinar on adverse childhood experiences, toxic stress, and resilience. It's interesting and very timely because the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention, we have been increasingly talking about adverse childhood experiences. My name is Felix Munger, and I work for the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. I am joining you from the Waterloo region in Ontario, and I would like to acknowledge that this is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. Today's webinar is sponsored by the City of Thunder Bay. Thank you very much. In her 45-year career, Dawn has been focusing on child well-being, exploring what is required to ensure that all children have the opportunity to be cognitively, physically, emotionally, and socially well. These explorations include early and adolescent brain development, children's mental health, newcomer children and diversity, family resilience, and physical literacy in the early years.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you very much, Felix, for the introduction to CMNCP. And I'm very pleased to be able to present this. I've had the opportunity of being in Thunder Bay a couple of times face-to-face, which is, of course, the preferred way of doing this, but we'll do our best here. So I have about a 45-minute presentation with some videos to show you. And should I be getting overtime, Christy's going to wave at me or something so that I can make sure that we're within our time limits. So what are today's topics? Felix mentioned ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So we're going to start there. And discuss how ACEs may impact lifelong mental and physical health. And also to take a look at the actual ACE study, which was conducted in the late 1990s and early 2000s. We're going to then look at toxic stress, which explains how the ACEs get under our skin. And they do that in 3 different ways. They can impact our developing brain, so in the very early years. Toxic stress and ACEs can attack the body's stress response and immune systems, which the ACE study demonstrated very clearly causes all kinds of health, both physical and mental health challenges later in life. And we'll talk about epigenetics, how ACEs and toxic stress actually can cause a gene to express itself or to remain silent. And through that process, that's how ACEs pass from generation to generation. But ACEs and our genes are not our destiny. So I want to end with us talking about resilience and what we can do to change this picture. So we'll be looking at things like biological sensitivity to our environment and the core skills that we can develop so that we can cope and adjust. We'll look at environmental influences, both positive and negative, and how they can change our genes or epigenetics. So we're going to start with the ACE study. And this is probably one of my favorite quotes. Vincent Felitti is is the doctor who started all of this work into ACEs. And his quote is that time does not heal all wounds. And we often hear that. We often hear, well, time, you'll be better in time. Give it time. Time will heal. And he's suggesting that that's not true, that time does not heal all wounds. Since humans convert traumatic emotional experiences in childhood into organic disease later in life. So while we may not be able to articulate or perhaps even remember an experience that happened in very early childhood, our brain and bodies never forget. So with any luck, we're going to be able to watch this video. It's a promotional video for a couple of films, which I would highly recommend that your organizations take a look at. One is called Paper Tigers, which is built into, it talks about a school down in Walla Walla, Washington, and how they converted the entire school process to an ACEs-based approach. Very vulnerable kids in an alternative high school. And then they've also got a film out on resilience, the biology of stress and the science of hope. So let's watch.
What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. And Felitti tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students, instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
My apologies for the slow internet. I live in rural Alberta, and that's one of our challenges. So hopefully it didn't interfere too much. So the ACEs study is one of the first times that there was a large, over 17,000 people involved, retrospective study, looking back at what happened to the patients in the first 18 years of their lives and moving forward. Most of these patients were now in their 50s or 60s. What health risks were they experiencing? So the categories of ACEs that they studied were these 10. 3 categories of abuse, 2 of neglect, and 5 of household dysfunction. There's been lots of discussion around the categories of ACEs that the study studied, but remember that it was a population health study. So they chose 10 where people could actually say, yes, that happened, no, it didn't. And that's important to remember, that it was an epidemiological health population study. This is what is important, I think. Now, this particular graph comes, of course, from the American study. So 33% of people in their study, so these are middle class, 80% Caucasian, obviously enough income to afford health insurance at the end of the 1990s. 33% of those had no ACEs. Similar studies in Canada have indicated that we have somewhere around 40 to 50% of our population that does not have any ACEs. Studies within our Indigenous population go way up, where there will be only between 10 and 20% of the population studied without any ACEs. In my classes, I teach child studies. These are students who are preparing to be early childhood educators, child and youth care workers, family support workers. We have 100% of my students have at least one ACE, because those are the people who tend to come into the helping professions. So the numbers without ACEs varies considerably, but take a look at what happens. If we look down the far left column, the 33% that have no ACEs, and we look at the number who smoke, who are alcoholic, who use IV drugs, who attempt suicide, move over into the next column with only 1 to 3 ACEs. What happens to those numbers? So 1 in 69 are alcoholic, but with only 1 to 3 ACEs, 1 in 9 are. We move from 1 in 480 using IV drugs to 1 in 43. We move from 1 in 96 people attempting suicide to 1 in 10. And the numbers get even more frightening if we move to the 16% of the population with 4 to 8 ACEs. 1 in 5 attempts at suicide. One of the things that they mentioned in the video was that people with more than 8 ACEs may live 20 years shorter, less than others. And this is the mechanism. So if you look at adverse childhood experiences at the bottom of the pyramid, we've talked about how that disrupts neurodevelopment, and we'll get into that in more detail in a minute. That's brain development. Because of that, those children develop social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, which leads them to adopt risky health behaviors. Those behaviors lead to disease, disability, and social problems, and there's your early death. Now, as I mentioned, the ACE study was in a population of primarily middle-class people, primarily Caucasian, and they studied only the ACEs that were in the top of this tree. So if you look at what's included within the branches and leaves of the tree in this infographic that comes from ACEs Connection, essentially the same 10 ACEs that were studied in the ACE study, except here they've put neglect and abuse together and added in bullying and homelessness. So those are other things that they have felt are important within the household. One that isn't added in here that I would also add would be death of a parent. But The categories in number 2, down in the roots, in the soil, under the tree, the community piece, that's the piece that really intrigues me. So when you think about that level, so think about the soil in which you plant a tree. If the soil is fertile and good soil, you'll have solid roots that will produce a healthy tree. If the soil isn't good, then the tree can't possibly have a solid foundation, won't withstand windstorms and other kinds of environmental traumas. But the fact that it's under the ground level is something that's often hidden from view. And I think the best example of that is what's happened during COVID. Dr. Theresa Tam, Canada's Chief Medical Officer of Health, just released her annual report on the health of Canadians. And in that report, she indicated that so far to date, about 80% of all Canadians who have died during COVID or from COVID have been in our long-term care. Now, our first thought is, okay, our seniors are at risk, our elderly are at risk because they've got all kinds of comorbidity. That's why they're in long-term care. But if you look at what's underneath the soil in this infographic, the realms of ACEs, and you think about who works in long-term care, we have our personal care assistants or healthcare aides, as we call them in Alberta, often earning substandard wages, low hourly wages, not working a full-time job, therefore not getting benefits, and therefore having to work in a number of different situations. Because of their low wages, they go home to poor quality housing that perhaps they share with a number of other people who are also doing the same sort of thing, working in a variety of different settings. For example, here in Alberta, we had a major issue with outbreak in long-term cares and outbreak in meat packing plants. On the surface, what's the relationship there? But on investigating it a little bit further, these were families where the women worked in healthcare, in long-term care, and the men were in our packing plants, living in crowded homes, poor nutrition, poor quality of home life, spreading the COVID, a perfect place for COVID to begin to develop, and then moving out into their multiple jobs and spreading COVID. So what happens underneath the ground is often what is really going to make a difference. And yet, under normal circumstances, it's often hidden. So if you look in here, we've got things like structural racism. And it's important to remember that race itself is not an ACE, but when you experience systemic racism because of your race, that becomes an ACE. We've got in here historical or intergenerational trauma, which is what affects many of our Indigenous peoples in Canada because of the colonial policies that Canada has been involved with. So what's underneath the ground then is often what is not visible. We see what happens in the tree, but it's what's underneath the ground that we often aren't aware of until something like COVID and the Black Like Me movement brings it right out. The third is the environment. This one is a really interesting piece for me because what I'm finding here on the right of that tornado funnel are the natural disasters. And I think people are noticing and commenting on how these natural disasters are not only increasing in frequency, but in severity. And perhaps that's because of the climate crisis. And yet we still have people in power, in governments, making decisions who are naysayers of climate crisis. So how do we move any work on ACEs forward if we have naysayers? So those are the ACEs. ACEs are the experiences. They by themselves are not the problem. The problem comes with the stress or the toxic stress that they bring about. So Harvard's Center on the Developing Child talks about 3 types of stress. Not all stress is bad. In fact, positive stress is what I'm experiencing right now. Giving this webinar, hoping the videos will move, hoping that my internet stays in place, hoping that I don't talk too much. Positive stress happens to us all the time. And it's positive because we're reaching outside of our comfort zone. we're taking some risks, we're trying something new, we're starting a new job, we're changing career, whatever it might be. And each time we challenge ourselves, we develop more coping strategies, more skills to be successful, and we build our skills and our self-confidence because we've moved through some positive stressors. One of our resilience researchers in Canada, Michael Unger at Dalhousie, talks about how we must have positive stress in our lives in order to build resilience. And when we bubble wrap our children or we're helicopter parents, we're not allowing them the opportunity to develop these skills at a young age when they still have supportive people around them. Looking down at the bottom, toxic stress is the prolonged activation of the stress response systems in our body in the absence of protective relationships. Now, sometimes that toxic stress is caused by those who should be our protective relationships. So for young children living in homes with abuse, neglect, addictions, mental illness, those family members are there, but either they're perpetrating the abuse and neglect, or they're not able themselves to be protective because they are too stressed. The tolerable stress in the middle is the interesting one. Here is where natural disasters or loss of a job or a car accident or family illness would fit. But if the family is supportive around the children, then they'll cope and develop new skills as a result of that stress. However, if that loss of job leads to food and home insecurity, leads to depression, leads to addictions, the people who should have been supporting those children around the loss of job are now no longer able to do that. They're not able to function. And that kind of stress then can become toxic. So when we talk about stress and the impacts on the body and relating it to ACEs, we should always be referring to toxic stress because not all stress is bad. So how does toxic stress get under our skin? Well, there's a double whammy. So on the left here, it's literally built into the developing brain. And I know I had the opportunity with Thunder Bay to play the brain architecture game with the participants in that group. And I strongly encourage you, if you're within a group, to consider playing the brain architecture game with your group members. It's a hands-on simulation of where you're actually building a brain using pipe cleaners and straws to the age of 8. And if that child is experiencing all kinds of ACEs or adversities as they're moving forward, the structure of their brain is so weak that when they're stressed later on, when they're 8 years old, the brain is not able to function. So toxic stress is literally built into the developing brain. On the other side, we have the immune systems of the body that are impacted. So I'm going to again show you a short video. This one's shorter, so hopefully it'll keep loading as we go through. And this will explain how toxic stress derails healthy development. This comes from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Ready? So let's take a look at a couple of slides to talk about what actually happens in the developing brain. These are MRI slides taken by Dr. Bruce Perry from the Child Trauma Academy. He got involved in this work after the Romanian orphanages were discovered in the 1980s. On the left, you see an MRI scan of a normal 3-year-old child. You can see the size of the brain. You can see the large white matter around the outside of the brain and fairly consistent gray matter. So the connections within the brain, there are many of them. This brain is relatively dense. This child has had many, many experiences. You look at the MRI scan on the right, and the first thing you notice is how small this brain is compared to the other child's brain. So many, many fewer connections or synapses within the brain. A much thinner layer of white matter around the outside and literally holes, black spaces in the gray matter. And those black spaces in the MRI scan on the right are primarily in the limbic region of the brain at this point. So this is where there's emotion, working memory, learning happening. And this child will be unable to access those parts of the brain. That piece is quite frightening. Now, in terms of the body, what happens to the body? So I live close to the Rocky Mountains, spend a lot of time hiking in the mountains. And so we worry about bears in the woods. So you see a bear in the wood, what happens? Well, your body goes into survival mode. You have to recognize the stress response. Are you going to fight, flee, or freeze? Is it a brown bear? In which case you might be able to flee. Is it a grizzly bear? In which case you've got to freeze. So you have to figure that out right away. And your immune system goes into battle stations. It's ready to fight the infection and wounds. When you're safe again, the body goes back to normal. So just like that little child in the video, it was a temporary stress. Mom picked the child up, soothed the child, everything calms down. What systems are involved when this happens? In this diagram at the top, you see the brain and autonomic system. So this is managing and responding. So do I need to fight or flee, or do I need to freeze? What am I seeing in the woods? Our heart and cardiovascular systems, we begin to pump blood more to distribute oxygen and glucose around our body so our body is stronger. You've probably realized that between that and the neuroendocrine system, which is a release of cortisol and adrenaline, your body often feels much stronger and you can jump further or run faster than you might normally have done because these two systems have come into play to make a stronger body for you. Your gut and metabolic system are turning the food into energy, and your immune system is getting ready to fight against infection and to heal disease. So this is what happens in your body. Now, when you have one stressor, like the bear in the woods or driving home on an icy highway in the wintertime, your body comes back to normal. But when there are bears in the woods everywhere, you go to school and there's bears in the woods, you go home and there's bears in the woods, you're in your bed at night and there's bears in the woods. This system never has the opportunity to slow down, to calm down, to go back to normal. It's like revving a car on high. And those systems start to break down. So here's the difference then between a temporary or an acute event where you've got the stress response and the battle stations. And then on the right, what happens when your body is constantly stressed. And you can see from this list here, this is what the ACE study found. These were the diseases that they saw 50 years after some of these experiences had happened to children. So when we think that young children may not remember the domestic violence or the abuse that they had when they were under 3 years old, they may not be able to articulate it, but their brain and their body hasn't forgotten. The one that was not studied on the ACE study is the one at the very bottom, the idea of dementia. And that one is worrisome in our aging population. And the third thing that's really interesting here, and there's a lot of print on this, but I'm going to give you a very simplified example. So epigenetics, all of our genes have a little light switch on them. And when the gene is turned on, it will express. When the gene is turned off, it's silent. So some of the genes that we inherit from our parents perhaps give us a predisposition to addictions. So our parents, our grandparents, our whole family for generations have struggled with addictions. So we've got a pretty strong gene that's going to predispose us to addictions. If we're raised in the same family as our parents and our grandparents and our extended families, if there's still a lot of addictions around us, home and food insecurity, violence, and so on, this gene will express itself. And we have a very strong chance of becoming an addict ourselves. However, if this child is born into a family that is now much more stable, they've got all kinds of supports around them, extra people helping them, they've maybe been able to address food and housing security, a good job, some education, this gene can actually be turned off and may not express itself. And so if we can get into some of these homes and provide the necessary supports, we have a good opportunity to turn off a lot of these genes. The problem is that's what creates intergenerational trauma. And so when people are told, look, you weren't in a residential school, or this didn't happen to you, you weren't in the Holocaust in Europe, get over it. You can't, because you've got this gene that is being expressed. So epigenetics talks about changing the genes from expressing to being silent during our lifetime and what we then pass on to our children. So to recap, ACEs are the experiences that may impact future health and well-being. It's not the experiences themselves, it's the stress that comes from those experiences. And it's important to remember that not all stress is harmful. It's the toxic stress that gets under our skin, and it does so in 3 ways: by derailing healthy brain development in the early years, compromising the body's stress responses, overusing them, breaking them down, wearing them out, building more inflammation in the body. And those people are the ones who are more susceptible. They're the vulnerable people who have been susceptible to COVID, and changes the expression of genes, the epigenetics, during the lifetime and across generations. So now we're going to get into the science of resilience and well-being. I'm not going to give you a definition of resilience. Probably most of you have many definitions of resilience that you've worked with. What I want to get into is, what is the science of this? What are the components of it? So most of us have already for a long time been talking about internal and external components, especially if you use something like the developmental assets, but we're going to look at it in a slightly different way. It's important to know that resilience is not static. You don't either have it or not have it. It changes over time, and it changes across situations. So we may have been able to be resilient to something that happened yesterday, but today, because there's been something else added into the situation, we're no longer able to cope or adapt. So our resilience is static. But the best thing about it is that it can be enhanced and supported in very obvious ways, and that's what we're going to look at. So the metaphor that I want you to think about here is the resilience scale. And you'll notice the components of this scale, that there are negative outcomes on one side of the scale and positive outcomes on the other. And so the idea is to try and stabilize, or perhaps even tip, the resilience scale towards the positive outcomes. And that can be accomplished in a couple of ways, not only by adding more positives, as in this graphic, than negative, But the fulcrum is an extremely important piece here because it represents our genetic inheritance and our epigenetics. So our genetic inheritance, what are we predisposed to? And as a result of our environment and the change to the expression of our genes, that fulcrum can literally be moved. So let's watch.
Resilience is the result of a highly interactive process between individual characteristics in the person and the environment in which that individual has developed.
It's really the counterbalancing of difficult things that may exist in the child's life with positive things that occur within the family, but even positive things that may exist in the community.
An easy way of thinking about resilience is like a scale with a fulcrum in the middle of it. And there are things on both sides of that scale, experiences of both bad things or good things.
Our genes shape where the fulcrum is positioned at the start.
There are certain genes that make a child more sensitive to the effects of maltreatment or parental neglect or witnessing violence.
The fulcrum may start out kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum, for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes, genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up or turning down the expression of chemicals in circuits in the brain and the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences accumulate and children learn coping skills that help them to manage stress, the fulcrum can slide, so the scale tilts toward positive outcomes more easily. That's what resilience is all about.
There's always an adult, or more than one adult, who is key to providing that relationship that helps to build resilience.
All right, so let's unpack that a little bit. So you saw Thomas Boyce in the video. He was the one who first introduced the resilience scale, and he also talked about the biological sensitivity. So he began to explore this concept of biological sensitivity because of his sister. So he and his sister were full siblings, raised in the same family, went to the same school. Now, obviously, there were lots of differences. Gender was a difference. She had different friends than he did. And he became a pediatrician, and she took her own life in her 30s. So what was it that made him able to survive but thrive, whereas she was unable to do so? And that's how his research led him to this concept of biological sensitivity. And through his research, which he first published in 2008, and then the book on the left there, The Orchid and the Dandelion, Why Some Children Struggle and How All Can Thrive, was published in 2019. So his research has indicated that about 80% of us have primarily dandelion tendencies. And if you think about a dandelion, many of us struggle with dandelions because they grow everywhere. They're plentiful. They grow in the cracks in your sidewalk and in your garden and in your vegetable garden and in places that you don't want them. But they're the ones who generally survive and thrive. So about 80% of us fall down into this category. We have minimally reactive stress response systems. We're often extroverted and outgoing. We move easily into novel and unfamiliar situations. And this point's important. We have average health under most conditions. So we'll often look at people or hear people speak, and I hear them all around me. Well, I was raised in a dysfunctional home and I'm fine, just look at me. And yet there will be others who were raised in that same kind of situation who will not have thrived. But even dandelions, we can kill them, and we work often very hard at doing that. And so not all children who are dandelion children will thrive or even survive. There's conditions that will take down even dandelion children. Now, this is a spectrum. We're not all completely dandelions or all completely orchids. But on the other end of the spectrum are the orchids. And orchids require special care. They need to be in the right humidity and heat and light and water. And when they have exactly what they need, they're incredibly beautiful, and they thrive. But dandelions are highly reactive. So if the heat goes out or there isn't enough water, you immediately see the changes in the orchids. They're often shy, often withdrawn. They have a lot of sensory sensitivities. So these are the children who are bothered by the tags in the back of their clothes or don't like to have their hair brushed. And they can have the best or the worst health and outcomes, depending on the context. So Boyce's research that says dandelions generally, regardless of what's happening in the home, will have average health. Now, orchids, if they've got incredible nurturing care, will perform way, way above dandelion children. But if they don't have that care and support, they can't survive. So it's an interesting concept, lots of stuff on the internet. Are you a dandelion? Are you an orchid? What are your children? But it's the first time that we've ever really thought that there's actually a gene that's either expressing itself or not to make us more sensitive to what's happening in our environment. So to wrap it all up around resilience, we have biological sensitivity, and that's an individual piece. We talked about in the video, they talked about coping skills or coping strategies. So each time we experience some positive stress with the support of others, if we're younger, maybe by ourselves if we're older, we continue to hone and refine the adaptation skills that we have that allow us to take these extra risks, to put ourselves on the line, to be willing to make mistakes and to just push a little bit farther. So those are our coping skills. Our environment, whether it's positive or negative, that not only loads the different sides of the resilience scale, but it also impacts our genetic structure and can move, because of how it changes whether our genes express or not, move the fulcrum underneath the scale. So Harvard Center on the Developing Child has come up with 3 principles, and this is where this directly connects to what I hope you're thinking about, some of your strategies and your tools and your resources that each of you are engaged in your various communities. I have put a link at the top here under the title. That used to take me to an interactive graphic, which last week disappeared off the website, which is a real shame. I don't know why it's not there. It still refers to it, but it's not there. So these are the 3 principles that Harvard is suggesting we need to look at, both for children when they're young, but also adults, that can make a difference, that can move where our fulcrum is on the resilience scale. So first is, and you'll notice I say first, but that's not true. The arrows are double-headed. So it doesn't matter where you start in this, but the idea that all 3 of these work together. So the first one I'll talk about is supporting responsive relationships. So this is ensuring that all children are raised in environments where there is at least one stable, nurturing caregiver. That may not be the parent or parents if they're not capable of doing that. So then it needs to be an early childhood educator or a teacher or a neighbor or a coach or somebody who is supporting them around those supportive relationships. But adults also need supportive relationships. Not only those parents who aren't able necessarily to provide them for their children, but for those of us who work with those families, we also need to know that we are supported in the work that we do, that we are earning a good wage, that we are valued for the work that we do, that somebody's helping us mediate our stress. We need that when we're working with others. So supporting responsive relationships works right along the scale. The same thing for reducing sources of stress. So if we can take that resilience scale and remove some of those negative outcomes from the end by ensuring that there's that our systems are not racist, that we are able to ensure that families, when they're struggling with food and housing insecurity, that funding is long-term, that we can put them into a program, know the program is going to stay there. We, as the workers in those programs, also need to have our sources of stress reduced. And strengthening core life skills, that means those skills that allow us to plan, to prioritize, to change directions if the plan's not working, to build relationships. Those core life skills need to be taught. We're not automatically born with them. They occur up here in the prefrontal cortex, and that part of the brain continues to develop until our mid to late 20s. So that's the prime opportunity. Teen parents, teenagers generally, their brains are ready for this kind of stuff, to learn how the core skills that will last them through life. But it doesn't mean if it's after the 20s that you can't continue to learn those skills. So if we look at what that means, here are some implications. Sorry.
Yeah, we're just at 12:25, Dawn, just to let you know.
Yes.
We're getting, and I'm bang on time.
Great.
I'm proud of myself. So principle number 1, and some of the implications for supporting positive relationships within policy. I'm not going to read all of these. Number 2, the second one there, that workers in service programs have adequate compensation, professional development and education, and supervision. And I think right there about the healthcare aides or personal care assistants in long-term care homes. I think about our early childhood educators in childcare centers. We need people who are working in those service programs to be valued, to be paid accordingly, so that their levels of stress are not such that they can't serve the people they're supposed to be serving. For practice, I really like the third one there. Provide staff enough time to develop relationships. So if we're working in a program where a social worker and our caseload is huge, and we just can't give the kind of time or attention to the clients who are on our caseload, or I look at teachers with classrooms of 35 or 40 children, and we're really hearing about that within COVID. How do you even have a personal conversation with 40 children every single day? And if you don't have a personal conversation with each of your children every day, are you building a relationship? So we need to consider things like the workloads that we're expecting our service providers to carry. Principle number 2, strengthening the core life skills. For policy, I really like the middle one here. I like this idea of 2 generational programs. So I did a lot of work with family literacy programs for a while, a bit ago. And so instead of bringing the parents in because their literacy was low, we said, we've got a literacy program for your children. Bring your children and we'll show you how you can help to develop your child's literacy. But the main goal was to ensure that the parents developed their own literacy. They wouldn't have come to a program because they weren't literate, but they certainly came to programs to support their children. So if we can build programs that are 2 generational, and then we're still valuing the work that the parent is doing and not saying you're not good enough. Implications under practice. Again, I like the middle one here. And you've probably been in situations, you've had a performance review at work and they say, and I want you to fix this and this and this, and I want you to do this PD and I want you to do that. If you have that's overwhelming, and you maybe have the skills to break it down into the small incremental steps, but a lot of the people we work with don't. And so we need to break down all of this stuff, celebrate the milestones, little tiny milestones. For example, if we're teaching interaction between parent and child, we can say, yes, you noticed that child wanted to get your attention, congratulations. Now we move on to the next step where you actually respond to that. And principle number 3, reduce the sources of stress. For implications for policy the third one here: consistent, adequate, and I would suggest long-term funding. I've sat on the board of the United Way of Calgary for many years. And for a long, long time, we were stuck in this cycle of one-year funding for all of the programs that we funded. And if you've been stuck in that cycle, in a one-year cycle, you spend half of the year putting together the proposal for next year's budget. And then you spend the rest of the year developing the evaluation assessment so that you can prove that what you did with the first year. And to bring families into a program that's only going to last for a year and then lose funding, it needs to be consistent, it needs to be adequate. And then the last one here for practice, and we've talked about this, but providing support workers with the supports that they need so that they can support their clients effectively. And we often forget that. So 3 thoughts to leave you with. ACEs affect people at all incomes and social levels. And that piece is really important. ACEs are not about us and them. It's not about those people living over there or those people who are using substances. ACEs affect everybody. It's us. And so when you're working with a policymaker and trying to explain the importance of ACEs, it affects all of us. And it can have serious, costly impacts. And right now, as we're all seriously working with damaged economies, every province and the country, it's going to cost a lot for the impacts of the lifespan. We're all concerned about the cost of healthcare, every province. But if we could somehow look at putting some of that money into prevention so that those healthcare issues didn't arise later in life, there have been cost-benefit analyses that say if we put more money into the early years, it will pay off in the later years. So this is almost a policy piece. It affects all of us. It's not an us and them. No one who has experienced significant adversity or many ACEs is irreparably damaged. Yes, we have serious long-term effects, but that doesn't mean we throw us away. We need to acknowledge what the trauma's done. And often when I work with people and we look at intergenerational trauma and the impacts on the body and the brain through epigenetics, and they say, well, it's not my fault that I'm an addict. Probably not. It's these things. And because it's not your fault, we can't expect you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You need those supportive relationships and programs to help you out of this. You can't do it on your own. This is not an individual thing. And by reducing, and here we again, we're looking at those 3 principles. By reducing family sources of stress, providing children and adults with responsive relationships, and adults meaning the families and those who are working with them, and strengthening core life skills, we all need to adapt to change. We can thrive, we can prevent and counteract lasting effects, health effects. Resources, these are direct links to everything that I used within the slides. The only places where they're not direct links is the Alberta Family Wellness and Harvard's University Center on the Developing Child and the Child Trauma Academy. That's because I hope that you will go to those websites. When I teach this as a course at the university, at Mount Royal University, the Alberta Family Wellness and University Center on the Developing Child websites are my textbooks because they're up to date. And they're constantly being changed and added to. And so I wanted to encourage you to go to those websites. And you'll notice the study, the ACE study, the largest public health study you never heard of.